Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. By sharing stories of successes and triumphs, we aim to challenge the dominant narrative that often negatively portrays our disenfranchised populations. I'm your host, Charles Williams, an educator for 15 years, a current school principal in Chicago, and an educational consultant. Let's get started. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Don't believe me? Here's 5 reasons why. First, it's free. Second, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. 3, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and so many more. 4, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. And 5, it's everything you need to make a podcast, all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. In this episode, I chat with P. Sloan Joseph, an instructional leader with over 17 years of experience working with grades K-4 through 12 in the areas of school and classroom culture and technology. She has a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from South Carolina State University and a Master of Arts in School Administration from Gardner-Webb University. Her career has included being a business education teacher, a Title I facilitator, a new teacher mentor, and an administrator. Sloan is currently the instructional technology coach at Greer Middle School, where she facilitates training for students, parents and guardians, and staff. She is also a co-organizer for EdCamp Greenville and co-creator of #BreatheEDU, a platform assisting school and district leaders with creating racially inclusive and equitable learning environments. She is a member of the Teach Better Team Speakers Network and a member of the SCA-SCD Emerging Leader Class of 2020. Sloan is also the host of Greater Is in Me, a podcast centered around her life as a wife, mother, and educator. The purpose of the podcast is to inform, inspire, and influence listeners to fulfill the greatness that exists within. Greater Is in Me is available on iTunes, Google Podcast, Anchor, and Spotify. During our conversation, Sloan addressed a common thread in education today, relationships, but helped to deepen our collective understanding by encouraging us to consider building a rapport with students. Relationships are simply connections and can be either positive or negative. Rapport, however, is dependent upon mutual trust and respect, something that she reminds us needs to be curated over time. Sloan also connects this to diversity, in that we need to be cognizant of our own privileges, both earned and unearned, and to learn how to respect the innate differences that exist between all of us. She suggests that we listen to varying perspectives, even if we do not agree, and that maybe, just maybe, we could help to address the teacher shortage by changing what our students see in front of them each and every day. After all, how are you showing up? I hope that you enjoy listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. Hello, Sloan, and welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you on. I am a fan. I've been listening to some of your episodes, so it's very nice to have you on my show as well. But before we get started, if you could do me a favor and just introduce yourself, share who you are, what you do, and a little bit about maybe why you're in this work.
Well, I am P. Sloan Joseph, and everyone just calls me Sloan. I am an instructional technology coach in South Carolina, and I'm a wife, a mother, an educator, a podcast host, and just an advocate overall for students to get the most equitable education that they can possibly have. So I'm going into, I started in the middle of a school year. So in January of 2021, it will be my 18th year in education. And I've had a unique opportunity, a unique experience, let me say that, because I didn't go to undergrad to be an educator. I went to college to be in finance and human resources, to be in the business world. And I did that for a few years and found myself as an educator later. So that's one unique thing that has kind of molded my view of education. The other thing is, I've had a unique opportunity to work in K-4 through 12th grade. So I've been able to see every level of this development that our students go through. And I think that gives me a different perspective than most people in education that work in one particular area. Another unique opportunity or opportunities that I've had is that I've been able to work at different types of schools. So I've worked in the public sector and the private sector. I've worked, like I said, high school, middle school, elementary. I've also worked in magnet programs. I've worked at some of your most affluent schools. And then I've worked at schools that are receiving Title I funding as well. And so I'm able to kind of determine those needs that certain groups of students need. And then also I'm able to identify that there's so much common ground no matter where kids are from and their zip code, who they are and what they need from educators. And so all of that experience has allowed me to have a passion for doing what's right for children and ultimately every day getting up and trying to inform, inspire, and influence teachers, parents, and students to fulfill the greatness that exists within. Because once they recognize that greatness, then most of the time people are willing, they're competent and confident enough to share it with the world and make the world a better place.
That's a perfect segue that you talked about greatness, because I wanted you to talk a little bit about, and I'm not selfish in any ways here with my podcast. I want to promote the great work that's being done. So can you talk just a little bit about your podcast, The Greater Is in Me?
Greater Is in Me is just a podcast where most of the time, well, all of the episodes so far is just me every 2, 3, 4 weeks. And one thing about my podcast, I don't have a regular schedule because I want to make sure that whenever I'm speaking, that it is powerful and empowering to people. So I kind of wait and kind of see what the universe gives me and what I experience. But basically, what I try to do is take whatever I'm experiencing and find a way to connect it to my life as a wife and as a mom and as an educator, and to use the mistakes and the challenges and the successes that I have in my personal life, in my professional life, to just tell this story. And so I tell people it's like a 15, 20 minute, like you could just run to Target right quick. It's not too long. You could run to Target or, run a couple errands or whatever. But I try to, it always has a message, a serious message for reflection. But we learn a lot and we laugh a little bit too. And I use my sense of humor and how I see the world in a lot of different ways to kind of entertain, but at the same time, educate people about how we can all fulfill the greatness that exists within.
And I appreciate that. As I was preparing for today's session, I was listening to one of your episodes and I chose one at random and it was perfect. It talked about enabling versus empowering. And it was exactly the conversations I was having with my staff members about parental duties during this time of remote learning. And it was perfect. So I appreciate you just kind of waiting until that moment hits and throwing it out into the universe, because it definitely is beneficial to people listening.
I appreciate that, and I've been listening to some of your episodes, and I'm just so glad that we connected. And even though we're not located in the same place, that we are connected in our thinking about trying to change the narrative about certain populations of students, what they can do, what they want to do, and the right way to get them there. And the right way, there's different ways, as long as we're trying to meet that goal, which is to allow those students to have the access and the opportunities that all students should have to be able to step into their greatness.
And so that's great. So can you share with me some of those ways that you're talking about that you might be trying to provide those access and opportunities, for our students as you are doing your part to help change that narrative?
Well, I think everything is built, and people say this all the time. They talk about relationships, and that's one of those words. Like, if you have to say it, but I've heard it so much. It's like
Hmm. Hmm.
that catchphrase, that educational catchphrase that everybody wants to say. But we're all in relationship, regardless of what we want to think. Some of those relationships are functional, and some of those relationships are dysfunctional. Um, what we need to kind of strive for, what we do need to strive for, is to have rapport, which is a positive relationship. And that takes time, that takes consistency, that takes communication, which means you can't always ask your students to share their thoughts, their feelings, their successes, their failures, and then you don't reveal things about yourself. Because then that's a one sided relationship and that's a dysfunctional relationship. So we have to be vulnerable with our students and share with them the things that we do well, but the struggles that we've had. What that does is that humanizes us, it builds trust. Then they see our personality, they see that we have been resilient, we are a model for what we're asking them to do. They are able to see this is what I can be. Once they trust you, they're willing to do whatever you ask them to do. But when you're inconsistent, or it's a one-sided relationship, whether it's telling your story or there's one side of respect, you want them to respect you, but you're not necessarily respecting them. And respect, let me say this, all of that's subjective. That a lot of times is built on culture. So they've got to learn what you determine is or is not respectful. But we've got to do the same thing with them based on their culture or where they're coming from. And working together, that builds that trust. And then you can have rapport. And then you can get more out of students than you ever could when we do it the other way. Um, Another thing is it takes time. So it's not something that can be done the first 5 days of school, the first 10 days of school. This is an ongoing relationship the entire time. And you have to have patience. You have to reflect and back up a little bit sometimes. You have to stop and connect. And that has nothing to do with content, just taking those times to have those class meetings to say, what's going well with us in this class and what's something that we need to change? What do I do well as an educator? And what do I need to change? And that doesn't mean that everything they say, I mean, they're children. So they're only going to see it from one perspective, but really taking those things into consideration. And if they know that you really see, hear, and value what they have to say, then they will then really see and hear and value you as the person in that room. Because again, it's a two-way street.
I'm so happy that you mentioned relationships and the idea that is it becoming way too overused. I don't know how many times I'm in, Twitter chats or in other spaces, and immediately that word comes to mind. And that is what I've been thinking. Like everybody says this. So is there a better way to put it? And I love the idea that you came up with of or using is rapport because it is something that is positive. It is meaningful because relationships are going to exist no matter what. We just got to avoid those dysfunctional ones. So I now have a new word. So if you happen to be in a chat with me and you see it, you
Absolutely. I got it out of the dictionary and I was like, oh, let me see what's another word for relationship because I was working on an online PD that I recorded. And from that point on, it just was giving all these synonyms and it was using and I was like, well, why is that different than any other word? And then when I looked up rapport, it was just talking about, the positive part of that. And I think that is a different word that goes a little bit deeper, like the relationship part. The way that people use relationship now is very surface level.
Mhm.
And I also think that one of the things here with virtual learning and e-learning or hybrid learning, blended learning, all these different things that we're calling it, we have to be mindful of. A lot of times we're thinking about the relationship that the teacher has with the students, but we also have to be mindful of the relationship that the students have with one another. So creating that environment where not only the teacher respects and sees and hears and values their students, but they are able to share that with each other. and any visitor that comes into the room or comes onto the Zoom or the Google Meet. So I think for so long, when we talk about relationships, we're talking about teacher to student, but we need to add a level to that where there's student to student relationship or rapport building that has to take place. And I think that's what creates a sense of community so that we can take the word community from being a noun to being a verb.
In I love we're talking about relationships and more importantly rapport. Let's start using that term instead. So what do you see? What are some of the obstacles that you have come across where people are saying, I'm trying to do this or I'm trying to do that? I know you mentioned time. People try to rush into this and build something that's not authentic. But what are some of the other obstacles that you see, in building, this rapport, whether it's between teachers, between students, or between teachers and students, or any other levels?
Well, we have to understand that our experience is not the only experience, and we have to move past empathy into action. And so I think we really need to, as leaders, be readers, and we've got to read about different cultures. We have to also, again, communicate, ask those questions. We're making decisions about students, but we don't ask students for their input on that. Or if we ask them for the input, it's like just checking a box to say that we did. But are we really considering, what our students are saying? So I think if we read a little bit more, and then that'll cause us to talk a little bit more and getting different perspectives and understanding that we can disagree on how to get there, but as long as we agree on what is the goal. And as long as we're doing that in a respectful manner where we're valuing people's individuality, I think that's where we're missing it. We want everybody to be the same, and sameness is not, that's not the way, because you're stripping someone of their freedom when you're saying the way that I do it is the only way that needs to be, it needs to be done. But you got to open your mind, and more importantly, open your heart so that you can truly listen to what people are saying, what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, and understand that your experience is not the only experience. And just because it hasn't happened to you or anyone that doesn't mean that that's like absurd, like that's in someone's imagination. When you listen to them and you value what they're saying, regardless if you agree with it, listen and just try to put yourself in their shoes. I think, again, taking the time to do that, even if at the end you still disagree, a lot of people will appreciate that you even took the time to allow them to express themselves and to hear them.
Sloan, I think what you just shared is extremely powerful. That in order to build rapport, you need to be able to listen, regardless of where you stand. And I really wish that these two individuals that I was watching on TV last night, took that into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I could have done an entire observation and given lots of feedback last night.
Yeah, that was something.
Mm-hmm. That's a word that you could use.
So, you were sharing some tips and strategies already, which is one of the next things that I would normally ask, about, as I already mentioned, listening, being mindful of actually those student relationships, respecting, individuality and of trying to avoid the sameness. I think we often get caught in that, right? That it has to be the way I do it because that is the way I know it. And an understanding that there are various ways, various methods. And so, what I would love for you to do, if you don't mind, is maybe sharing an example, a story of yours where you put this into practice and maybe how that changed the outcome. I know I listened to one of your stories about a young man who didn't have his computer. And so, you were kind of being mindful of that and his girlfriend mouthing that she loved him. So I loved, I love that story. But, do you have any examples of you putting this into practice in those 18 years of your experience?
Oh, definitely. And I always try to tell people, a lot of, the longer you do this, and especially if you have the opportunity to teach in different environments, you pick up so many nuggets like along the way. Um, and I wasn't always like this. Like when I first started out, I wish I could just get like the first 3 years of kids that I taught and just like have a reunion and just apologize and say, listen, I was a horrible teacher. Like I wasn't a horrible teacher in the sense that I was a horrible person, but I didn't, I did the very thing that I just said that you shouldn't do. Like it's my way or that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, I've learned about giving kids choice. So I was a related arts teacher. I taught business marketing and computer technology. And so in those classes, you don't really get to kind of categorize your students as gifted and talented, and then have another group that's like your middle of the road students, and then what people would like to call the low group, like these labels that we give kids. And I think one of the reasons that I'm the kind of educational thinker that I am is because I was in a situation where my kids weren't categorized. They were all in the same class together. So if no other class, you had to learn how to get along with people from other socioeconomic backgrounds, other races, other ability levels. Like we're all in this together. And so that made me really learn about choice. And as a technology teacher, there's all this tech out here. So this is the goal. I need y'all to do a presentation. Now, and here's your rubric. Now, what that looks like, it's on you. And like the kids used to look at me like, well, can I do this? Yes. Like they weren't used to that. They were used to, okay, you have to do a PowerPoint. Mm-hmm. You have to do a Google slide. You have to present in front of the classroom. Like if I had Flipgrid when I was in the classroom, oh my goodness, because then I would have been able to give my children a choice. Do you want to stand in front of the class or do you want to do it through Flipgrid? Now, if it's a public speaking class, we're going to have to eventually learn to stand in front of a group. But to be able to gradually, like if I were in the classroom now, like I would get them to practice on Flipgrid before they ever stood in front of an entire class of people. That gradual release, but giving them that choice of how would you like to present it. And I think that is what people want. They want options. When you think of the most angry people, they're frustrated because they don't have choices. They feel like the rules have been written for them and those rules are unfair to them because they didn't have any input and they didn't have a choice. And I think I got better work out of my students once I started doing choices. The other thing is once I started rewarding them on a consistent basis and I started to acknowledge the students that were doing things well, because we spend way too much attention on the kids that don't do well, whether it's academically or behaviorally. And so once I started to really elevate and acknowledge those students that were doing well, their effort, coming to class on time, helping each other out, making good grades, all of those things, then I really started to speak to the heart of those kids and they became more confident and competent in my class. And hopefully that, led into their personal lives and they took that back to their families and their communities and made it a better place.
Thank you. You're absolutely right in this idea that, no input, no choice leads to frustration. And then we sit there and we're wondering, well, why are you not doing the work? Why are you so upset? Why are you tuning me out? Right. And it's exactly that. I always try to do this with my staff, and the idea that I try to do with them, right? I try to model for them what I expect them to do with their students. And it's that same thing. I want to make sure that you're having choice. I want to make sure that you're having input, because if I don't do those things, you're going to be frustrated. And now you would know what your students feel like. So
yeah,
I'm,
absolutely.
Sloan, there was something you mentioned earlier, and I don't know if we can revisit that or not, but you talked about, you spent all this time and you've been all over the place. And regardless of the schools you're in, regardless of, whether it's a magnet or a regular school, affluent or Title I, that there's so much common ground. Can you share maybe just one or two things that you noticed that it doesn't matter what school you're in, where it's located? These are common threads that exist throughout.
Absolutely. Several things. I one thing that I know, and I tell people this all the time. I think the worst and the best thing that ever happened to me was that I started my first job at an affluent high school. Being that I was able to see what the end game is because they were in high school, but not only that, to see how the affluent are provided for and supported and how those parents fight for their kids, you know? And for the most part, those parents did not care that I was Black or that I was a female. Once they recognized that I was there to fight for their child, to give their child the best education that I knew how, that's what most people want for their children. I think all people really want that for their children. They want the best for their children. Mm-hmm. But what happened is then when I went other places, I was like, I always had that standard. It's like you're always trying to go back to that. Like, why don't these kids have the same access and the opportunities and choices that other children have? So, but no matter where I've gone, students like structure. They don't need a teacher that one day is like very energetic and then the next day very gloomy, because that doesn't build trust. And it goes back to what I was talking about, because now it's like Las Vegas, like it's a crapshoot. Like, I don't know what kind of mood she's going to be in today. So, and just being kind of even keel. They like consistency. They like fairness. Because the kids are watching us and they learn us quicker than we learn them, because it's 30 of them in a class and it's only one of us. So they're very observant. And they notice when you treat the athletes a different way, or the girls a different way, or the Black kids a different way, and the white kids a different way. And we don't know, like you said, we're modeling some of these negative things that we talk about in our classrooms, because classes are a reflection of society. And so if we want things to change in society, then we have to start by changing some things in the way we do things in the classroom. Students, no matter where they are, want to be acknowledged for the things that they do well, even if it's not academically. Thank you for coming to class every day. Thank you for now coming to class on time. Thank you for helping your classmate. Just those different things. Everybody likes to see their name. Everybody likes to hear their name, no matter where they come from. And finally, no matter where I've taught, kids want to know that you believe in who they are, that you believe the best about them, that you love them, that you care for them. And they can tell, I think you used the word authentic. They can tell if you're being authentic. If you're like, I love you guys, but those are words, how do you show them that? And when there's no structure, there's no inconsistency, there's unfairness going on. They're like, yeah, you're saying you love me, but I see how you treat my classmates. I see, different things. And so our words have to match our actions.
What you just shared was profound. I'm glad that you shared this. I think there exists this misconception, this notion, regardless of what environment you're in, about how the other half are, right? Where
Right.
it's, that group, they don't care, or they're not invested, or, whatever those notions are. But at the end of the day, as you listed out, there are some basic fundamental things that students, regardless of where they exist, all have these same desires, that they want to be acknowledged, that they want to be cared for and loved. And, and even our parents, and this is the one thing that upsets me. I've spent my entire time in urban education, the notion that they don't want what's best for kids. And I don't know, well, I shouldn't say no parents, but parents overall, they want what's best for their kids. And so they don't care, who you are for the most part. But they definitely want what's best for their kids. So I'm so happy that you shared those things, because it definitely shrinks the world in which we live in, and maybe cuts away at some of these misconceptions that exist.
And the other things, I think we don't, as one of the things, and again, this has happened over time. I didn't come to understand how powerful and impactful student achievement is on, and how it's impacted by the parent or guardian's experience at school. Mm-hmm. So my son is going to have a good school experience. One, because my husband and I had good experiences in our K-12 programs for the most part, right? So then we don't have a problem advocating for him and believing that school is a good place because it was a good place for us. That's foundation, right? The next thing is my son is going to do well in school because he has two educated parents. On top of that, the next layer is not only are we educated, but we're educators. So we know all the acronyms and we've read the data and we read educational books and we know what should and should not be going on. So there's three levels of advocacy that my son has. Now, that's not to take away from his natural born intelligence, but he doesn't have a learning disability. He has two parents that had a good educational experience, and they're educated, and they're educators. Like, that's called privilege. A lot of kids don't have that. And so in the same way that I understand that that's a privilege for my son, I have to also understand what would happen if you stripped all three of those layers away. So if you take that same child that's raised by two parents that did not have a good school experience, or those parents did not get formal education, or they're educated with formal education, but they don't know all of the ins and outs of education like we do from the day-to-day tasks that go on. What happens with that kid? And so that's why it's very important for us to get to know our families and their stories and their experience with the public school or their school background, because that'll lay the foundation for you understanding that child. For instance, I hear parents say all the time, well, this kid, he's going to be bad in math because I was bad in math. Well, the way that parent can advocate, and the anxiety and the stress and maybe some of the insecurity they have with helping their child with math comes from their experience, not from the teacher, not from that child's ability. And so that's why we really have to be mindful of our experience is not everyone's experience. But if we listen to those stories and we get to know our families and we build that rapport, then we can fill in those gaps. Because sometimes it's not that people don't want what's best for their kids. They don't know how to do that. And all of the parents right now have never gone to virtual school. Like, you've got some parents that maybe got their college degree online, but there's no parent right now that went through a K-12 program the way their kids are going through K-12 programs right now. And so there really has to be a lot of patience and grace and training for our parents so that they're confident and competent enough to support us in what we want them to do. But we also need parents to show up so that they can get the information that's needed so that they can then support their child. So it's both ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think what we're talking about right now is how do we break that cycle, right? We as educators, we can focus, we can do all these things about what has happened, but there's nothing that we can do. But if we understand the now, understand our current situation, like you said, understand the families, right? And look toward the future to make sure that our students are educated, make sure that our students have a great experience in school.
Right.
When they become parents,
Exactly.
their children will have a different experience, hopefully. And we begin to break those cycles that exist. And that's what we need to focus on. And so, Sloan, I am so happy that you and I hopped onto this conversation today, because I'm hoping that somebody out there is like, oh, that's it. My light bulb went off. I'm going to go and try to break this cycle. So thank you for your words of wisdom. You've thrown out a lot of little like catchphrases. I'm definitely going to go back and like listen to this over and over again. And so if you see them on like posters somewhere, I'll give you some credit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wish I could. Some of these things, it's not me, it's just people over the years. And some of them I make up myself. I don't know. That's probably a talent or a gift of some sort. I also want to talk about just quickly, when we talk about teacher shortage, I was having this conversation. So one of the things I also do is myself, along with two of my colleagues, Shalonda Blakeney and Hamilton Parks, who teach here in South Carolina locally with me, we have a Twitter chat called Breathe EDU. And when we breathe, we inhale and we exhale. And so inhale is to receive information and exhale is to share information. And so we do that on the chat. And that's the second and the fourth Thursday of every month at 7:30. And it's a quick chat. It's from 7:30 to 8. And one of the things that we talked about in the last week when we did the chat was, and well, let me go back. And Breathe EDU is all about talking about different topics that will help people to start to think about and create racially inclusive learning environments, not just for students, but students of color, but also for educators of color and those families that support those students of color. And so we started talking about the teacher shortage. And I think, historically, people need to kind of do some reading about the impact of integration on Black educators. But another thing that I want to talk about with the teacher shortage, regardless of race, is that we have a unique opportunity every day to recruit future teachers. And if we do not seem like we enjoy our jobs, why would any student want to then do that? Because it's not for the money. Like, the kids know we don't get paid, like, for real. So they have already figured that out. But what ignites us now is our passion. So how can we empower that passion in a child that's sitting in our classroom? And so all of those interactions are kind of like a job interview. And there's no way, we can't wait until they get to college or till they get to high school. Their passion and love for wanting to be an educator starts as soon as they start. And we continue to mold and develop that and nurture that. That's one way that we can eliminate the teacher shortage, by just loving on these kids and making them feel like they can do anything. And in the midst of that, they're going to want to do what we did. They'll have the option, again, giving kids options to do what we do. But we'll continue to have, because money is always going to be a battle for us. So the only other thing we can do is really speak to the heart of our students so that they'll want to do what we do, regardless of the money. And so I always tell people that just remember that no other business gets a chance to recruit for like 12, 13 years, except for educators. And what we show them, that's going to make them either determine, I can't ever do this, or I would really love to make a kid feel the way that my teachers have made me feel. And that's what we all want. And so we are able to break that cycle right now if we put our minds to it.
Well, educators, those of you who are listening, you have heard the challenge. We'll consider it a challenge, that show up every day, because what are you saying? Ask yourself this: when you show up every day to work, what are you saying about this profession? What are you telling your students about this profession? Because we complain all the time that there's not enough of us, but what role are we playing in that? So it's a good reflection piece and a good challenge as we begin to wrap this up. So before we leave, Sloan, I know you shared the Breathe EDU Twitter chat, so please make sure that you go and check her out on the second and fourth Thursdays from 7:30 to 8 o'clock. I know I just made plans to be there this week myself. But Sloan, what are some other ways that people can follow you and just see the great work that you are doing?
I'm on Twitter at P Sloan Joseph. So that's PSLOAN Joseph, JOSEPH. And then I'm on Instagram at Greater is in me _ And then if you're a podcast person, I have the Greater is in Me podcast. That's on Anchor, Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts. And then on Mondays, I do Greater is in Me Mondays, where I either do some type of journaling strategy, or I do a recap of an old podcast episode, or just a general message. Again, 15 to 20 minutes. And I do that on Instagram Live and on Twitter /Periscope Live as well. So join me any of those places to get a good message. And then also, check in with me and ask questions, or also tag me in some things so that I can continue to learn and we can continue to share together and really impact these students and their families and our communities. And we can continue to inform, inspire, and influence each other.
Well, Sloan, I appreciate you not only being on the show, but all of the amazing work that you are doing all around education. So I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. Please keep up the great work. May you and your family be safe through this craziness. And I look forward to seeing you in the Edusphere.
Absolutely. And the same to you and yours.
I want to thank you for listening to the Counter Narrative Podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please be sure to like and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow the show on Twitter at the CN Podcast and the host at _CW Consulting. Take care.